At my farewell corporate reception, marking 40 years as a federal magistrate, I watched my nephew's hand hover just a moment too long over my glass. The room was warm with applause, the kind reserved for endings that are supposed to feel clean. When the cutlery slipped from my fingers, it wasn't an accident. Under the table, I exchanged the drinks without looking down. I had spent a lifetime reading intention in silence. 5 minutes later, he stood to address the room, holding the glass he thought was mine. That was when I understood the night had never been about gratitude or legacy. It was about removing me, quietly, efficiently, with witnesses who would never realize what they'd seen. Before I go on, let me ask you something personal. If you've ever felt the ground shift beneath you in a room full of smiling faces, you're not alone. Stay with me, subscribe if you feel this story resonate, and share your own experience in the comments. Sometimes the only justice begins with being heard. The reception had been staged with a precision I had once admired in my own courtroom staff. The building itself was a restored exchange hall, all iron beams and tall windows, positioned to catch the last light off the harbor. By the time I arrived, dusk had already settled into the water, turning it the color of polished slate. Inside, everything gleamed. Linen-draped tables, soft amber lighting, a string quartet placed carefully near the far wall, their music calibrated to suggest dignity without demanding attention. It was the kind of event designed to reassure people that institutions endure, that transitions happen smoothly, and that men like me step aside without disturbance. For 40 years, I had been part of that reassurance. My name was projected behind the podium in tall, restrained lettering. Beneath it, a curated sequence of photographs scrolled slowly. Early days in narrow offices with overflowing shelves, later years in larger chambers with cleaner lines, the inevitable headshots meant for reports and announcements. Each image had been selected to tell a story of continuity and calm. I recognized the narrative immediately. It was the same one I had approved for countless other retirements, confirmations, and ceremonial departures. I was meant to sit beneath it, accept the applause, and quietly become history. What unsettled me was not the scale of the event, but how little of it felt spontaneous. Every movement had been anticipated, every seat assigned, every pause filled. The applause rose and fell on cue, like a tide governed by something other than wind. Around me sat people who had once deferred to my judgment, who had adjusted their posture when I entered a room, who had weighed their words carefully in my presence. Now they smiled freely, relaxed in the knowledge that my authority had an expiration date measured in minutes. At the center of it all was my nephew. Aaron had insisted on overseeing the arrangements personally. He had framed it as a gesture of respect, a way of giving back after years of guidance and mentorship. I had not questioned it. He was competent, efficient, and outwardly devoted to process. The kind of man who understood systems well enough to move through them unnoticed. I had even felt a quiet pride watching him circulate that evening, checking details, smoothing edges, accepting compliments on my behalf. That pride curdled the moment I noticed his attention wasn't on the room. It was on me. Not in the obvious way of a host monitoring a guest of honor, but with the narrow focus of someone tracking a variable in an experiment. His eyes returned to my table too frequently. Not lingering, not anxious, but precise. Each time a server passed. Each time my glass was refilled. Each time I lifted it and set it down again. There was no warmth in that observation. No shared sentiment. Only measurement. I remember thinking, with an odd detachment, that I had seen this look before. It was the same look junior attorneys wore when waiting for a witness to contradict themselves. The same look compliance officers adopted when watching a system under stress. It was not curiosity. It was confirmation. The applause around me began to feel hollow, as if it were happening in another room. I became acutely aware of the physical details I would normally ignore. The weight of the cutlery, the thickness of the glass, the faint citrus scent rising from the drink placed before me, sharper than I expected. I had consumed enough of these receptions over the years to know when something was out of alignment. Experience had taught me that danger rarely announces itself. Presents as order taken one step too far. When I let the cutlery fall, the sound was lost in the music. It was an insignificant motion, easily dismissed as fatigue or age. Under the table, my hands moved with the same steadiness they always had when signing warrants or reviewing affidavits. The exchange of glasses was inelegant but effective. No one noticed. No one was meant to. What struck me most in that moment was not fear, but a sense of displacement. Surrounded by people who had once respected my authority, I felt something colder than humiliation. Humiliation requires an audience that understands what is happening. This was different. I felt managed, reduced to a procedural obstacle to be resolved quietly, with plausible deniability built into every step. The respect in the room was real, but it was no longer relevant. Respect, I realized, offers no protection once someone decides you are inconvenient. As the program continued, I watched faces instead of listening to words. I noted who leaned forward, who glanced at their phones, who looked toward Aaron for cues. Patterns emerged quickly. A few people near the edges seemed alert in the way professionals do when they sense deviation from the expected script. Others were fully absorbed, content to consume the narrative being presented to them. I had spent my career reminding people that process exists to restrain power, not conceal it. Sitting there, beneath my own projected legacy, I understood how easily process could be repurposed. With enough planning, even a farewell could be weaponized. By the time Aaron rose from his seat and moved toward the podium, I was no longer uncertain about the nature of the evening. The applause that greeted him was generous, almost affectionate. To them, he was a dutiful nephew honoring a retiring uncle. To me, he was a man stepping into the final phase of a plan that had been drafted long before invitations were sent. As he reached for the microphone, holding the glass he believed was mine, I felt a strange calm settle in. The evening had not been designed to celebrate my restraint and balance. It had been designed to test whether I still possessed them. The program moved forward with the inevitability of a docket already approved. There were no surprises on paper, no deviations from what had been circulated weeks earlier. A brief acknowledgement of the institution, a sequence of testimonials, a final address meant to bridge the past and whatever came next. I had reviewed versions of it myself, made minor edits, suggested language that emphasized continuity rather than disruption. I understood now that those drafts had been scaffolding, not structure. The real architecture had been built elsewhere. When Aaron began to speak, his tone was measured and respectful. He knew how to perform sincerity without excess. He spoke of my career in the abstract first, invoking words like stewardship, balance, and restraint. He praised the discipline of the law rather than the man who had applied it, which drew approving nods from the audience. It was a safe approach. It reassured people that the system mattered more than any individual who served it. I had used the same framing myself when presiding over departures that needed to feel orderly. He then narrowed his focus, recounting moments that had been carefully selected to suggest mentorship rather than authority. He spoke of conversations we had shared, lessons absorbed quietly, guidance offered without demand. To anyone listening, it sounded generous. To me, it sounded curated. He was building a record, not delivering a tribute. Each sentence positioned him closer to the center, not by asserting ambition, but by implying inevitability. As he spoke, I watched his hands. At first, they rested comfortably against the podium, fingers relaxed. Then, gradually, they began to move more than necessary. Small adjustments, a shift of grip, an unconscious brushing of the glass beside him. The changes were subtle, the kind most people would attribute to nerves. But I had spent decades observing testimony delivered under pressure. I knew the difference between anxiety and miscalculation. His phrasing began to soften. Sentences lost their crisp edges. Words that had been rehearsed landed slightly out of sequence, forcing him to correct himself mid-thought. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would alarm an untrained audience, but enough to register with anyone accustomed to evaluating competence in real time. The cadence of his speech slowed, then sped up, then slowed again, as if he were adjusting to conditions he had not anticipated. I did not look away. The room, at first, remained indulgent. Polite smiles held. A few people chuckled at remarks that had been intended as light humor. But something in the atmosphere shifted, not emotionally, but procedurally. The kind of shift that occurs when data begins to diverge from projection. A former clerk 2 tables away leaned back slightly, her eyes narrowing. A compliance officer near the aisle stopped clapping between points and folded his hands instead. These were not reactions of concern. They were reactions of assessment. Aaron continued, unaware that the narrative had begun to slip from his control. He spoke about ethics with an earnestness that bordered on excess, emphasizing the importance of foresight and the responsibility that accompanies authority. In another context, it might have sounded admirable. Here, it rang strangely recursive, as if he were reminding himself of principles he had already decided to bypass. His voice thickened slightly, consonants blurred. He paused longer than necessary to gather his thoughts, then resumed with a sentence that repeated an idea he had already covered. I felt no satisfaction watching this unfold. What I felt was a distant recognition of process asserting itself. A decision made earlier, quietly and deliberately, had entered its execution phase. Once in motion, it could not be reversed by intention alone. Systems, once triggered, do not negotiate. They observe, record, and respond according to design. Aaron had assumed the system would see what he wanted it to see. He had not accounted for the presence of others who understood how to read deviation without panic. On paper, in preparation, he had believed himself insulated. Family connection, professional proximity, the optics of devotion. He had wrapped the act in ceremony, assuming the ceremony would obscure the act itself. It was a common mistake. I had seen it made by people far more powerful than my nephew, all of them convinced that context could override consequence. Reality, as it often does, disagreed. A bead of moisture formed at his temple. He lifted his hand to brush it away, then seemed to forget what he was doing halfway through the motion. The glass beside him remained untouched, though his eyes flicked toward it more than once. His balance shifted slightly, forcing him to widen his stance behind the podium. It was still recoverable, I thought. A competent speaker could have shortened the remarks, invited applause, and exited gracefully. But this was not about grace. This was about completion. The audience began to adjust without speaking. Chairs creaked as people repositioned themselves. A senior consultant near the back glanced toward the event staff, then back to the stage. Someone stopped recording on their phone. Another person raised theirs, hesitating, then lowered it again. These were micro-decisions made by people who sensed that documentation might soon matter. Aaron's voice faltered on a name. He corrected it, smiled tightly, and attempted to regain momentum by returning to broad statements about legacy. The irony did not go unnoticed by those trained to detect it. His gestures became less controlled, his movements slightly exaggerated, as if compensating for something internal that refused to stabilize. I remained seated, my expression unchanged. For the first time since the cutlery had slipped from my hand, I allowed myself to look around the room fully. Not at the man speaking, but at the system responding. No one intervened. No one rushed forward. This was not a crisis yet. It was an anomaly under observation. Protocol had not been breached. Thresholds had not been crossed. The machine was still gathering information. And that, I realized, was the quiet cruelty of it. Aaron had intended to remove me without triggering alarms. Instead, he had placed himself inside a mechanism designed to detect exactly this kind of irregularity. He had underestimated the room not in intelligence but in training. These were people who understood that when something looks wrong but not catastrophic, you do not react. You watch. You wait. You let the pattern reveal itself. As he concluded his remarks, the applause came, but it was thinner now, less synchronized. He stepped back from the podium with visible effort, lifting the glass at last in what was meant to be a closing gesture. The liquid inside caught the light briefly, then steadied. I did not raise mine in return. By the time he returned to his seat, the evening had already shifted beyond his control. The betrayal had moved from intention into record. Not because anyone had accused him, but because enough people had noticed that something was not proceeding as designed. In that moment, I understood with clarity that surprised me. This was no longer about me being honored, nor about him being exposed. It was about a system correcting an error. What followed could no longer be contained within the language of ceremony. The evening did not collapse. It destabilized. There is a difference. Collapse draws attention. Destabilization operates quietly, redistributing weight until the structure can no longer pretend equilibrium exists. Aaron returned to his seat beside me. The distance between us was minimal, but it felt cavernous. I could sense the effort it took for him to remain upright, the way his shoulders held themselves with deliberate rigidity, as if posture alone might restore control. He avoided looking at me. That, more than anything else, confirmed what had already become evident. This had never been about celebration. It had been about authorization. For months longer, I now understood. There had been a campaign conducted beneath the surface of familial concern and professional diligence. Subtle inquiries into my health, framed as affection. Suggestions about workload reduction, disguised as respect for my age. Casual remarks about simplifying assets, about streamlining decision-making, about ensuring continuity in the event of unexpected changes. Each comment taken alone had seemed benign. Together, they formed a pattern I recognized too late because I had been conditioned to trust the voice delivering them. My retirement had not been an endpoint to be honored. It had been a vulnerability to be exploited. As Aaron sat beside me, his breath uneven, his skin taking on a tone that no amount of ambient lighting could disguise, the scope of the violation crystallized. This was not merely an attempt to embarrass me or diminish my standing. It was an effort to render me unreliable in the eyes of the very systems I had served, to create doubt where there had been none, to replace my autonomy with guardianship, to convert a lifetime of earned authority into a liability requiring management. The body in this context was not incidental. It was the instrument. I thought of the documents he had encouraged me to review weeks earlier. Trust amendments presented as housekeeping. Medical authorizations suggested as precautionary. Financial access framed as efficiency. He had not rushed. He had not pressured. He had waited for moments of fatigue, for days when the accumulation of years made rest feel earned rather than suspicious. He had leveraged familiarity, not force. That was the most intimate betrayal of all. The room continued to murmur around us. Conversations resumed in clusters, tentative at first, then steadier as people reassured themselves that whatever had just occurred did not require their intervention. Plates were cleared, glasses refilled. The machinery of the event persisted, even as its original purpose dissolved. From the outside, it might have appeared that nothing had gone wrong. Internally, everything had. Aaron shifted again, placing one hand flat against the table as if grounding himself. His other hand trembled briefly before he curled it into his lap. I could hear his breathing now, shallow and irregular. He leaned slightly toward me, then stopped, as though reconsidering the wisdom of proximity. For a fleeting moment, I wondered if he would speak, if he would attempt explanation or appeal. He did neither. Control, once lost, does not return through conversation. I felt a curious detachment as I observed him struggle. Not satisfaction, not anger, a kind of professional sorrow, perhaps. I had seen defendants undone by plans that assumed too much compliance from reality. The law is unforgiving in that way. It does not punish intent. It corrects error. Aaron's mistake had been assuming that proximity to power equated to immunity from scrutiny. My retirement had become an incident. My body had been reduced to a vector for procedural advantage. My legacy, carefully constructed over decades of restraint, had been positioned as leverage against my own future. There was no language in statute that fully captured that kind of violation. It existed in the space between ethics and harm, where trust is weaponized without leaving visible marks. As the minutes passed, his condition worsened in ways that could no longer be plausibly attributed to nerves or fatigue. A bead of sweat traced the line of his jaw. His gaze lost focus, drifting past the table toward nothing in particular. A server approached, hesitated, then retreated, her training conflicting with instinct. Somewhere nearby, a chair scraped softly against the floor as someone stood, then sat again, undecided. Still, no one intervened. Not yet. I remained still, my hands folded, my posture unchanged. Years on the bench had taught me that escalation is often fueled by reaction. I would not provide one. Whatever was unfolding no longer required my participation. The violation had crossed its threshold the moment he acted on it. Everything after was consequence working its way toward visibility. When he finally attempted to stand, it was not graceful. His chair tipped slightly before he caught himself, drawing a ripple of attention from those nearest. A few heads turned. A few conversations faltered mid-sentence. This time, the anomaly could not be ignored without conscious effort. I felt no triumph watching it. Only a quiet certainty settle into place. He had sought to control my future by compromising my present. Instead, he had exposed himself to systems that do not negotiate with intent or excuse. The violation had been intimate, yes, but intimacy does not confer protection when evidence begins to accumulate. As he steadied himself, gripping the edge of the table too tightly, I understood something with unexpected clarity. This was no longer about what he had tried to do to me. It was about what he had revealed about himself. And once revealed, such things cannot be unseen. The first sign that the evening's internal logic had begun to fail did not come from the stage or from our table. It came from the periphery, where people trained to notice irregularity tend to position themselves instinctively. Those who live by protocol rarely occupy the center unless required. They observe from angles that allow them to see patterns others miss. A former regulator seated near the aisle stopped engaging in conversation altogether. His body angled subtly toward Aaron, his attention no longer divided. He did not frown or whisper. He simply watched, his expression neutral, his assessment underway. Nearby, a compliance officer, someone who had once briefed me on risk frameworks so dense they required diagrams, tilted her head slightly, as if recalibrating a mental model that no longer fit the data being presented. These were not emotional reactions. They were professional ones. The applause that followed Aaron's attempted recovery was delayed, uneven. A few people clapped out of courtesy, then stopped when they realized others were not joining in. The sound dissipated quickly, leaving behind a quiet that was not awkward, but alert. Silence, in such rooms, does not indicate confusion. It indicates attention. Someone near the back rose and excused themselves, moving with purpose rather than embarrassment. Another leaned toward a colleague, murmuring something too low to carry, but urgent enough to register in posture alone. The string quartet faltered briefly, then resumed at a lower volume, sensing the shift without understanding it. The official explanation had not yet been articulated, but it was already failing. Fatigue, nerves, a demanding day. These were the stories people reach for when they need continuity more than truth. They work only as long as the observable facts remain compatible. Aaron's condition was no longer compatible. His attempts to appear composed required more effort with each passing minute, and effort, when visible, invites scrutiny. A senior partner I had known for decades stopped mid-sip and set his glass down untouched. His eyes flicked once toward me, then back to Aaron, as if confirming a hypothesis he had not yet voiced. Another individual, someone whose career had been built on internal audits no one ever wanted to discuss, crossed his arms and leaned back, the universal signal of reassessment. No one said my name. That, I realized, was significant. If the narrative were truly about me, about my age, my health, my capacity, someone would have looked to me for confirmation or denial. They did not. Their attention remained fixed on Aaron, on the anomaly that had introduced uncertainty into an otherwise controlled environment. The focus had shifted from outcome to source. I remained still, not out of strategy, but because movement felt unnecessary. The system was doing what systems do when given sufficient time and information. It was isolating variables. Aaron, not I, had become the point of concern. A member of the event staff approached our table again, this time with a different expression. She asked quietly if everything was all right. The question was not addressed to me. It was directed at him. When he attempted to respond, his words came out slurred enough that she hesitated, then nodded too quickly, retreating without resolution. That hesitation traveled. Within minutes, people who had been laughing moments earlier began to speak in lower tones. The energy of the room changed from celebratory to observational. No one panicked. No one dramatized. They simply adjusted the way professionals do when an assumption fails. This was no longer a retirement party. It was an incident unfolding in real time, and incidents demand documentation. I noticed phones appear, not raised, not recording openly, but held discreetly at waist level, screens lit briefly, then dark again. Messages sent. Notes made. The kind of quiet communication that precedes formal response. Those who knew how institutions worked understood that whatever explanation eventually surfaced would need corroboration. Memory alone would not suffice. Aaron attempted to stand again, perhaps to excuse himself, perhaps to reclaim some measure of dignity. This time, a hand reached out. Not mine, but that of a colleague seated across from him, steadying his arm without comment. The gesture was instinctive, not conspiratorial. Communicated concern without alliance. Concern in such contexts is neutral. Alliance is not. The first crack in the narrative widened. Someone suggested medical assistance, phrasing it as a precaution rather than a necessity. The words were chosen carefully, designed to preserve face while initiating protocol. Aaron shook his head too vigorously, then stopped, disoriented by the motion. That refusal, more than his condition, triggered the next shift. When individuals decline help they clearly need, systems escalate. I could feel the attention of the room moving away from the stage entirely now, converging instead on the small radius around our table. Conversations ceased outright. The quartet stopped playing. The hum of the HVAC system became audible, a reminder that even well-appointed spaces are never truly silent. For the first time that evening, someone looked at me directly, not with pity, not with curiosity, but with a question in their eyes. Not spoken, but clear enough. I did not answer it. I did not need to. Whatever they were beginning to understand no longer required my confirmation. The illusion had not collapsed dramatically. There were no raised voices, no gasps, no rush toward spectacle. It fractured quietly, along lines visible only to those trained to see structural failure before collapse. The story that had been prepared, celebration, fatigue, nerves, could no longer support the weight placed upon it. In its place emerged something more troubling and far less controllable. Uncertainty. And uncertainty, once introduced into a room full of professionals, does not remain idle. It moves, it spreads, and it demands resolution. Aaron had intended to manage perception. Instead, he had activated a collective instinct honed by years of exposure to risk. When something does not fit, you stop accepting explanations and start collecting facts. I sat there, surrounded by the quiet recalibration of an entire room, and understood with measured clarity that the evening had crossed an irreversible boundary. No one knew the full truth yet, but enough people knew that the official version was no longer sufficient. And that, in institutional terms, is where accountability begins. Once the room tipped into observation mode, I stopped thinking about the evening as an event and began thinking about it as a record. That shift came naturally to me. It was the same internal adjustment I had made countless times when a case moved from preliminary hearing to evidentiary review. Emotion receded. Pattern took its place. With clarity came memory. Not sudden revelation, but recontextualization. Details I had filed away as inconsequential returned, rearranged, and aligned themselves into something coherent. Aaron's attentiveness over the past year. His interest in my schedule, my workload, my energy levels. The way he framed concern as efficiency and efficiency as kindness. His repeated suggestions that I deserved rest, that I had earned the right to step back, that certain decisions might be easier if someone else handled the mechanics. At the time, I had interpreted it as generational eagerness paired with respect. I had been wrong about the balance of those two elements. There had been the financial review he proposed shortly after my retirement announcement became public. He called it a courtesy, a way of ensuring everything was clean before I transitioned out of public life. He had asked for access not directly, but through intermediaries, positioning himself as a facilitator rather than a beneficiary. It was an elegant approach, one that left no fingerprints if examined superficially. Then there were the conversations about health. They were never explicit, never alarmist. He would reference an article, a colleague's experience, a statistic about cognitive decline in high-stress professions, always framed as general information, never as diagnosis. He had asked once, lightly, whether I had considered consolidating my medical records. Another time, whether I had thought about appointing someone to step in just in case. Each suggestion arrived wrapped in reasonableness, designed to feel like foresight rather than intrusion. I understood now that these were not idle thoughts. They were contingency planning. As Aaron struggled visibly beside me, I traced the outline of that plan backward with the same methodical attention I once applied to complex financial schemes. The goal had not been public disgrace. That would have invited investigation too quickly. The goal had been ambiguity, a moment witnessed by the right people, interpreted through the lens he had been quietly polishing for months. A suggestion later reinforced that I was no longer fully reliable, that my judgment might require oversight, that decisions I resisted could be reframed as symptoms rather than choices. In that context, the substance in the glass was not meant to incapacitate permanently. It was meant to introduce doubt. I felt something settle inside me then. Not anger, but resolve. I had spent a career reminding myself and others that the most effective response to bad faith is not confrontation, but structure. Systems exist precisely because individuals cannot be trusted to police themselves when incentive clouds judgment. Aaron had counted on my silence, on my desire to preserve family dignity, on my reluctance to invite scandal at the moment of my own departure. He had misjudged what silence meant to me. Silence was not acquiescence. It was preparation. I did not speak to him. I did not accuse him or ask questions. Anything I said in that moment would have been absorbed into the narrative he was still trying, desperately, to stabilize. Instead, I allowed the room to continue its work. I watched as staff conferred discreetly, as someone stepped out to make a call that was not personal, as a security presence adjusted, not intrusively, but perceptibly. I was no longer reacting to events. I was positioned. In my mind, I began cataloging what would matter later. Who had noticed first? Who had attempted to assist? Who had withdrawn? Who had communicated quietly? These details form the backbone of any institutional response. They determine credibility when timelines are reconstructed and motivations examined. The truth, I knew, would not emerge through confession or drama. It would surface through process, medical assessment, documentation, toxicology, excess logs, financial records. The very systems Aaron believed he understood well enough to manipulate would, given time, articulate the story he had tried to tell in reverse. I also understood something else with a clarity that surprised me. This was not personal to him in the way betrayal is often personal. It was procedural. He had identified a vulnerability and moved to exploit it, confident that proximity and familiarity would shield him from consequence. In doing so, he had treated my life as an administrative obstacle rather than a moral boundary. That distinction mattered, because procedural betrayal leaves a trail. As the decision was made, quietly, efficiently, to involve medical professionals, I felt no need to assert myself. My steadiness would speak for itself in contrast to his instability. I answered questions when asked, succinctly, without embellishment. I declined assistance politely. I did nothing that could later be reframed as confusion or distress. Years on the bench had taught me that credibility is cumulative. You do not build it in moments of crisis. You arrive with it or you do not. By the time paramedics entered the room, the narrative had already shifted beyond recovery. What had begun as a farewell had transformed into an incident requiring neutral evaluation. Aaron was escorted, not restrained, his protests soft and unfocused. The glass was collected, the table cleared, the space preserved in the subtle way professionals preserve scenes without announcing that they are doing so. I remained seated until instructed otherwise. In that stillness, I felt something I had not anticipated. Relief, not because justice was assured, that would come later, but because the burden of response had lifted from my shoulders. I had recognized the threat. I had acted to protect myself. Now, the matter belonged to systems larger and less sentimental than family. For the first time that evening, I was no longer the subject of someone else's plan. I was a witness, and witnesses, when patient and precise, do not need to raise their voices to be heard. The truth did not arrive with raised voices or public declarations. It arrived the way truth usually does when institutions are allowed to function without interference, incrementally, methodically, and without regard for anyone's preferred outcome. Aaron was escorted from the hall under the pretense of precaution. That phrasing mattered. Precaution implies neutrality, an absence of accusation. It preserved dignity while enabling scrutiny. Medical staff did not rush. They assessed. They asked simple questions. They noted responses. The difference between those responses and mine would later become part of the record, though no one said so aloud. Security adjusted their posture, their spacing, their attention. No one blocked exits. No one dramatized the moment. The room was cleared gradually. Guests thanked for attending. Apologies offered for the unexpected disruption. It all unfolded with the careful choreography of damage control, the kind designed to preserve reputations until facts determine whose reputation deserves preservation. I was asked, politely, deferentially, if I felt well enough to remain briefly for follow-up questions. I agreed, not because I felt obligated, but because there was no advantage in leaving. Those who depart scenes early often surrender narrative ground without realizing it. In a smaller adjacent room, I sat across from two professionals whose expressions revealed nothing. They asked about the evening, about the glass, about whether I had noticed anything unusual. I answered plainly, no speculation, no accusation, just sequence, time, observation, action taken. I did not offer motive. Motive, I had learned, is something others prefer to assign once evidence constrains imagination. Aaron was assessed separately. The substance in his system was identified quickly, not because it was exotic, but because it was familiar. A compound designed to impair coordination and speech without immediate loss of consciousness. Subtle enough to be dismissed as fatigue in the right context. Predictable in its effects. Difficult to explain away once documented. The glass he carried to the podium was tested. The residue told the rest of the story without commentary. What he had prepared for me became the proof against him. Chemistry, unlike family, does not negotiate loyalty. When he was confronted with the findings, there was no outburst, no denial, no attempt at emotional appeal. His response was almost disappointing in its restraint. He spoke as though explaining a miscalculation in logistics rather than an act of betrayal. He referenced timing, dosage, assumptions. He spoke of contingency as though it were a neutral concept, detached from consequence. That, more than anything else, clarified the matter for those listening. This had not been an accident. It had been a plan executed prematurely. Authorities documented everything. Statements were taken. Records requested. Access histories examined. The months of quiet groundwork he had laid, financial reviews, health inquiries, draft documents, emerged into visibility when viewed together. What had once appeared as diligence now read as preparation. The narrative he had hoped to construct collapsed under the weight of its own thoroughness. I was not asked to confront him directly. I am glad of that. Confrontation suggests symmetry, as though we occupied opposing sides of an argument. We did not. He had acted. The system responded. My role was not to express outrage or demand explanation. My role was to remain intact and truthful, and to let consequence proceed without interference. When I did see him briefly, hours later, it was in a corridor stripped of ceremony. He looked smaller there, not diminished by guilt, but by exposure. Plans thrive in private. They wither under light. He did not apologize. He did not accuse. He simply acknowledged that the outcome had not aligned with his expectations. That, I realized, was his final error. He had expected outcome to matter more than act. There was no shouting, no satisfaction, no sense of victory. Justice, when it is lawful and procedural, rarely offers emotional catharsis. It offers closure. It offers record. It offers finality without spectacle. As I left the building that night, the harbor lights reflected cleanly against the dark water, unchanged by what had occurred inside. Institutions, like tides, continue regardless of individual failure. I felt the quiet weight of that continuity settle around me, not as comfort, but as confirmation. The reversal had already occurred. Not because I had outmaneuvered him in some dramatic sense, but because he had mistaken access for authority and familiarity for immunity. He had assumed that proximity to my life gave him license to rearrange it. He had been wrong. By the time formal charges were prepared, there was nothing left to argue. Evidence does not respond to persuasion. It responds to scrutiny. And scrutiny, once invited, does not leave until it has finished its work. I returned home that night alone, unescorted, unmedicated, and unconfused. I slept without interruption for the first time in weeks. Not because the ordeal was over, it was not, but because the burden of uncertainty had been removed. The matter was no longer personal. It was complete. I did not return to my chambers after that night. Not because I was barred from them, and not because I felt wounded by what had occurred, but because something in me understood that the chapter had already closed. 40 years of public service had taught me when to remain present and when presence becomes an indulgence rather than a duty. This was the latter. The weeks that followed unfolded without drama, exactly as they should have. Reports were finalized. Medical assessments confirmed what had been evident to anyone trained to observe without bias. Financial and administrative reviews traced the outlines of intent with a clarity that no explanation could soften. Aaron was charged, processed, and eventually sentenced. His career ended not with condemnation, but with omission. His name simply stopped appearing where he had expected it to rise. No appeals altered the record. I was informed of each development through formal channels, the language precise and unemotional. I appreciated that restraint. Justice, when administered properly, does not require flourish. It requires accuracy. I provided testimony when requested, brief and factual. I declined interviews. I made no public statement beyond what was necessary to conclude my service officially. Silence again served its purpose. When the proceedings concluded, I made a decision that surprised some and concerned others. I left the city, not abruptly and not in retreat. I sold the apartment that had kept me close to institutions I no longer needed to orbit. I relocated to a smaller courthouse town, one with narrow streets and an unhurried pace. Close enough that I could walk when I chose to, far enough that no one expected me to weigh in on matters that were no longer mine to carry. My new home is modest. Light enters easily in the morning. I drink my coffee near a window that looks onto trees rather than water. I know the names of the people at the market. They know mine, but not for the reasons people once did. Here I am not an authority. I am a participant. I mentor occasionally, at the request of those who still believe experience is something worth transferring. I volunteer where neutrality is useful and recognition unnecessary. I wake without obligation and sleep without review. The quiet is not empty. It is earned. When I was informed of Aaron's release years later, the message arrived in the same neutral tone as everything else. No expectation of response. No invitation to comment. I read it once, set it aside, and continued with my day. I felt nothing sharp. No resurgence of anger. No satisfaction. Only finality. Some betrayals burn themselves into memory because they are emotional. Others resolve into clarity. This one did the latter. What he attempted did not define me. It clarified what I had always understood but perhaps not fully accepted. Authority is not something others grant you permanently. It is something you steward for a time, then relinquish intact. Attempts to seize it through manipulation always fail eventually, because authority without legitimacy collapses under its own weight. I did not reclaim my dignity that night at the reception. I never lost it. What I reclaimed was something quieter and more personal. The right to step away on my own terms, without distortion, without apology, and without compromise. The right to live the remainder of my life ungoverned by someone else's agenda. In the end, there was no grand reckoning, no moment that demanded witnesses. Just a life restored to its proper scale. And sometimes that is the most complete form of justice there is.